Great, so welcome to people who are joining. Very nice to have you join us for this SPP Human Rights Chapter event. We're looking forward to a great session with lots of fantastic speakers who you can hopefully see on your screen. We will run through brief introductions in a second. I'm Louise Herring from AIM Progress. We are one of the organisations that help to run the Human Rights Chapter, along with the lovely Victoria, who's also here, and you will be seeing her shortly. And we're going to co-host this session. There she is, just popping her camera on. Great. So yeah, we're going to give it a couple of minutes just to allow people to come in. Probably give it to about 3 minutes past, and then we'll run through the housekeeping. For those of you who haven't used this version of Teams before, I will go through this in a second. But we have got a Q&A function that we're going to be asking to use from the question and answer session. Sorry, we'll ask you to use the Q&A function as we go through. And our speakers have reliably said they will use that Q&A function. Please do feel free. I can see people giving us some weather checks and saying hi on the chat. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves and tell us where in the world you are and whether it is raining or not. And if you are in Singapore and it's late, thank you so much for your dedication and for joining us. That's fantastic. Very impressed by that. We will come to the links and things in a second. My lovely co-host, Victoria, may pop the link in for joining the SPP Human Rights Chapter. If you haven't yet joined, we would love to have you and your friends from procurement and supply chain join us. So we'll put that link in, no doubt, a couple of times. And yes, you've got two functions on Teams for today: the chat, which we'd like you to use for introductions and telling us where you are and where the weather is, what the weather's like, and then the Q&A, which we'll use for the more formal questions for the presenters. So it is 3 minutes past our start time, so I'm going to get going, and I'm sure we'll have other people joining. But very big warm welcome from the SPP Human Rights Chapter to today's event. Our topic for today is: do you know if there are human rights risks in your category? How would you know, and what would you do next? So the clue of what we're going to be talking about is in the title. For everyone, I'm sure, on this session who's working on human rights, the issues that we're going to be talking about today in terms of transparency and risk assessment are really fundamental to the start of any organisation's process of making sure that you're meeting the requirements of due diligence legislation. And we've got some fantastic experts that are going to talk through that in more detail, as well as bring us some really practical examples from a whole range of different sectors. So really pleased that we've got speakers from Action Sustainability, Balfour Beatty, Ergon and Roche joining us today. Just a little bit in terms of SPP, if people don't know anything about the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, it started with the two gentlemen you can see on the screen, Thomas and Bertrand, who really wanted to drive sustainable change and to do that through procurement. So they're really where the SPP started. If you have joined and you're not on mute, please could you make sure you are for the session? That would be great. Maybe one of my co-hosts could make sure people are muted. In terms of the principles of the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, they really are about driving change together, sharing knowledge and listening to others. So really pleased that today's session is going to be following those principles. And the SPP has a very ambitious goal of getting 1 million procurement professionals to commit to the Sustainable Procurement Pledge by 2030. So we really appreciate you joining in helping them achieve that ambition. In terms of the chapters, there are different types by country, topic and by industry, and you are joining a session by the Human Rights Chapter, which is led by Victoria and a gentleman called Bora from Danone, and supported by AIM Progress, the organisation that I work with. If I think Victoria's already posted the link to the Human Rights Chapter in the chat, so please do join if you haven't already. And there's plenty of other information that we'll come back to you afterwards about how to join the SPP and be an active member of this community. So just checking that everyone can see the screen just before we launch properly into today's session. Were there some challenges there, Victoria, or have they been sorted out?
I think all's been sorted out. Agustina perhaps just needs to dial in and dial out because other people can see your screen all right. So I think
fantastic.
Thank you.
Great, brilliant, thank you. So today's session, we have got 5 fabulous speakers and room hopefully for Q&A at the end. In terms of the flow, we're going to start with Steve and Catherine from Ergon, who are going to talk us through how do you understand your human rights risks. Then we're going to hand over to Joe at Balfour Beatty, who's going to talk you through how they've created their company's risk assessment and really flesh that out for you. Then we're going to hand over to EJ, who's representing Action Sustainability as well as the Supply Chain Sustainability School, who's going to talk through the reality of human rights risks in both facilities management and services. And then we're going to finish with the fabulous Dorota from Roche, who's going to talk through risk management from a human rights perspective in healthcare. As we go through, please do use the Q&A function. So you've got at the top the chat function, but also the Q&A function. Please do use that to ask your questions as we go through, and we'll be asking the speakers to respond via that means as much as possible. We will be sharing the slides after this along with the recording. I know people are always keen to find that out. And we will try and secure 10 minutes at the end of the session where Victoria will be handling the in-person live Q&A, so you'll have that opportunity as well. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to Steve and Catherine at Ergon to get us started. Thank you very much again to all our speakers and to everyone joining.
Thanks very much. So I'll just do a quick introduction as far as who we are. So my name's Steve Gibbons, you see on the slide there, and I'm joined by my colleague Catherine Morgans. And we're from Ergon, and for those of you who don't know us, we're a sort of consultancy, not a sort of consultancy. We are a consultancy based in London, Amsterdam and Berlin, though Catherine has the good fortune of sitting in Malaga in Spain. And we work very specifically on human rights, labour and gender, so that's all we do. And we work with a whole range of different sectors, from retail through to sports, through to infrastructure, through to finance. So what we're going to do for the next sort of 13 minutes or so is talk a little bit about, why you should be doing human rights risk assessment, and then a few sort of frameworks of how you might do it. And a lot of this is taken from our work, particularly around agribusiness as far as supply chains, but not only agribusiness. We're also bringing in our experience working with procurement professionals in pharmaceuticals, in manufacturing, and in a whole range of other sectors as well. So I'm not going into lots of detail, but all of you will be aware as far as the emerging sort of legal requirements, which have really taken a ratchet up, I think, with the adoption of the CSDDD a couple of months ago. But the way we look at this, and you'll see on that sort of graphic there, and we've moved to do this kind of graphic rather than that one you've all seen, which seems to get busier and busier, that goes over a timeline, but thinking as far as the legal requirements in terms of sort of maturity of expectations, but splitting out reporting requirements and due diligence requirements. And I think the key thing is that we're seeing over sort of the last couple of years is quite a lot more in that top right quadrant. So the expectation is not only that you report on action or even inaction, which was totally acceptable under things like UK Modern Slavery Act, but you're expected to do something. Now, one thing that you really are expected to do, and a starting point, is to, map value chains, map procurement, and actually have an idea of what risks are out there. And that's risks both to people and to the business we're talking about here, but particularly to people as far as human rights is concerned, and actually go through a process of actually assessing where you should be prioritizing. And that prioritization process we'll talk about, but is really essential to have an idea of what's out there and what issues you should be looking at and focusing on. So as far as what kinds of human rights risks are out there and which ones are more likely than not, here's a couple of sort of indicators, which in our experience tends to give you a suggestion that there may be sort of higher risks. Now, I just want to start by saying from the human rights community, and this is someone who comes at least partially from that community and with a legal background, they tend to look at outcomes in terms of compliance, in terms of what actually happens in a workplace, in a field, wherever it may be that we're looking at. But what we're looking at here is sort of indicators of actually commercial or other contextual factors that may lead you to bigger pockets of risk. And those are, one is that high risk developing countries or regions. Another one is multi-tiered and complex supply chains, lack of transparency as far as procurement supply chain is concerned. Some sectors are higher risk than others, and we can talk about that. Outsourcing, subcontractors are all familiar with this kind of thing. Lower skilled workforce, temporary workforce, and vulnerable groups, and volatile pricing or downward pressure. Now, we're going to talk very briefly about some of our inputs as far as information that may give you a better sort of guide to actually constructing that risk matrix that you need to be doing. But also these things, some of them are actually inputs that you know from commercial and sort of decision makers as far as the way that things are sourced as well. So the kind of questions that we would normally be looking at and working with sourcing or procurement teams to actually develop sort of matrices and questions to be sort of screening for human rights risk will be, one is, are there geographies that have higher risks? Are there products that have higher risks? Are there specific labour types that have higher risks? And what about non-labour human rights risks, whether that's be on community, on land, on civil political rights? And what about contextual factors? And context is one, conflict is one, and we've all seen a lot around Ukraine, around spreading conflict, and radiating out in many ways from Gaza. But also, what's the relationship to the company? What leverage have you got? What spend have you got as far as those risks are concerned? Now, the kind of inputs, and on the next slide we'll show you some examples of how we've done this, but there's lots of inputs out there, and on the right hand side we've given some, and we won't sort of go through all of those, but there's lots of information out there that you can input either as indices or raw information or working with other providers to get that information, which will give you indicators on some issues, particularly around geographies, products, and even labour types as well. There's also conflict sort of indices that can help with this also. But also what we tend to also do when working with clients, the one we've got our own proprietary indexes that you wouldn't expect a consultant to come without saying, finally, yes, there's something we have really special sort of recipe and juice that can help on this. But also crucially, it's important to look at your own data and your own audit or other data to see if that can help you develop sort of better risk assessment, but also just talking to people and understanding, where they see the risks are. We find this increasingly important to actually get a better picture for this rather than just relying on indices. So as far as next is concerned, here's some examples of how we've done this, and it's kind of a filtering process. So it is that we will normally feed in, if you can see this, apologies if it's a little bit small, as far as what publicly available information is there, what we know, and what we tend to do is put this into a scoring methodology. Now, the reason why we use a scoring methodology, and I'd really recommend looking at this if you can, particularly if you've got a number of spend categories, is the human rights world is very much one of word and narrative, and it often somebody mute that noise, thanks. So quite often when you're looking at that narrative, you'll be able to you'll see problem, you'll see challenge, and everything ends up red. Whereas we find that if you go through a process, and we find it's a very useful process to do a binary process going through likely, not likely, widespread, not widespread, etc., and have a cumulative binary set of answers to these questions, which then give, as you can see a little bit there, some of these sort of scoring in terms that will give you higher or lower risk in terms of particular either geographies, spend categories, etc., and we find it's a long process, but it's actually, at the end of the day, it's a much easier process once you get this to allow you to actually do some degree of actually focus across a whole spend category or across a whole supply chain. And here's some examples of some of the tools that we've given, which we'd be happy to share offline, as far as how we've done some of these risks. And some of the issues are publicly available. For example, the forced labour indicator tool that we worked on with SEDEX, and we've also which is also available, and I think it's a similar logic for this as far as contractors and suppliers, which I know certainly on the next session, as far as facilities management is a really useful way to do this. We've applied this same kind of approach to those kind of contractors and service suppliers as well, which is available on SEDEX also. Sorry to give SEDEX too much of a plug at that point in time. So I'll hand over to Catherine, who's going to give us a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Steve. So what are the types of human rights risks that you might come across in a risk assessment? Here we're going to give some examples from the cocoa sector in Côte d'Ivoire. I think it's worth mentioning that there's a lot of kind of structural factors which play into the risks, which then manifest itself in the supply chain. So kind of widespread labour informality, poverty, kind of a lack of public services. But within the supply chain, the types of things we would come across include child labour, particularly hazardous child labour. So that's kind of children working with tools or pesticides, for example. Forced labour, particularly affecting migrant workers from Burkina Faso or Mali. Working conditions issues, notably low pay. Living income challenges, and that means kind of incomes of small producers who then ultimately cannot invest back in their farms and then end up in these kind of cycles of poverty, unable to kind of raise yields and so forth. Occupational health and safety challenges. There's very limited awareness of occupational health and safety and limited use of personal protective equipment, for example, when applying agrochemicals, which can have quite serious health impacts. Discrimination and gender-based violence, largely affecting women in cocoa communities. Land rights issues, so that could cause kind of confusion and conflict relating to land within the community. Deforestation and other related community impacts, for example, water contamination as a result of the misuse of agrochemicals, and also a lack of effective grievance mechanisms. So lots of cocoa producing areas in Côte d'Ivoire are very remote. You have this kind of high level of informality, and ultimately workers and producers don't feel as if they have kind of routes to remedy or options for kind of raising any complaints with the issues they face. Next slide, please, Steve. Great. So once you have an idea of what those risks are, kind of what do you go on to do next? What happens after a risk assessment? So on the right-hand side there, you can see an example of kind of the human rights due diligence process. So going on from kind of risk assessment and impact assessment onto prevention and mitigation, working on perhaps grievance and remedy, monitoring those kind of actions that you take on, and also taking a bit more of a strategic look at your kind of human rights policy and governance. In the left-hand box, you have some examples of the types of work and projects that we would normally take on with a client following their risk assessment. So one of the most common would definitely be kind of human rights impact assessments, which tend to look at kind of high-risk supply chains or high-risk sites which may have been identified through that risk assessment. And it's really an opportunity to have more of a kind of deep dive piece of research into the risks, the root causes, the relationship and that the company has to those risks, and also to develop some potential kind of mitigation and prevention activities. We also support clients through reviewing their human rights strategy, policies and processes, perhaps reviewing kind of purchasing practices and contractor management processes, supporting the development of tools or any capacity building for in-house teams such as procurement on human rights issues, supporting the development of grievance mechanisms within companies, And last but not least, also helping clients identify opportunities for multi-stakeholder collaboration on some of those risk issues. And I think that's particularly relevant to some of the issues that we saw there on the cocoa slide, where perhaps the behavior of one company may not bring about kind of significant change, but there's much greater scope for change through collaboration with other companies and stakeholders in the space. I will leave it there for now, but thank you everybody, and looking forward to your questions.
So just to sort of close out on that, Louise, and also sort of raise your question, I think the key point sort of, and looking at that circle here, is that the sort of the big change in many ways is that it's a response to, we've done this risk assessment, what shall we do? Oh, continue to audit. Is not what we're at now. Somebody's been saying this for some time, but certainly the expectation is that audit will play a role, but it will play a role in the monitoring and reporting process, sometimes in prevention and mitigation, but it's not kind of enough. The idea is that you will be looking for risk assessment to allow you to prioritize, look at high risk, and then do something a bit more. Yeah. So in terms of how you're responding to it, and potentially de-risk whole parts, of a spend category or even a geography, to say this is on care and attention, but other things need more focus. So I think that question, as far as consistency in how risk assessments are dealt with, I think the answer has come below it, and I think that's absolutely right. One is there should be more transparency. Now, I think that may be some alignment, but also I think what we should hopefully see is a little bit of a sort of a competition to do this better. Because that also means that you need tools that are really relevant to you and to your sector and your business, which I think are best developed not by consultants but by the companies themselves. That's bad consulting skills there, but that's definitely the case. The other point is, I think we're still yet to see how much we can actually better use the massive data that's out there, and I do think that AI and machine learning could be implemented much better, particularly on the massive audit data that's sitting out there everywhere, to actually say, well, we need to be focusing there. Yeah. So I think that's another point, is that, again, we all talk about AI, but that could be really better used to actually focus on where you need to be doing this kind of assessment.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you, Catherine, for that great introduction and giving us the top line. There's a question in the chat. I don't know if you could just, in 1 minute, Steve, from Victoria, about the organisation, who in the organisation champions the risk assessment and the role of procurement.
I think that really varies. I mean, sometimes it's sustainability. A lot of the time it's actually procurement and procurement chiefs, or even chief risk officers we've had, particularly in those markets, jurisdictions as far as headquarters, so Germany, Switzerland, that we've been working, which have already got legislation. Suddenly, the two pieces of legislation in both of those, KVI in Switzerland and the German Supply Chain Act, where it's gone much more to board level and to legal and risk level, is saying, well, we need to be able to do this. How do we incorporate this into the broader enterprise risk assessment process? Now, for me, that's where you need to be getting to play this game, rather than sitting in best case scenario, a sustainability silo, worst case scenario, and I'm seeing this already, a human rights silo. Whenever, when you've got sort of human rights teams that are working on their own, it's almost pointless, to be honest.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And I just, as always, technology isn't always our friend. So the lovely Q&A function, not everyone can access. So I've just copied a question from Molly over from the Q&A into the chat. If you don't, I think it's very similar to what we've just talked about. If you don't mind responding to that via the chat, that would be great. Yeah. And for those of you online, if you could use the chat from now onwards and not the Q&A function, because it seems not everyone can access it, that would be great. So thank you very much indeed to Steve and Catherine for the introduction. I'm going to hand over now to Victoria, who's going to lead us through the rest of the speakers for today. Over to you, Victoria.
Great, Louise. Thank you very much. And Louise, you're putting me on the spot because you had the slide with the.
Oh, that's fine. We're going to Joe next, Victoria. So that's fine. Yeah. And I know Joe's going to be ready to go. On you, Joe.
Is going to be ready to go. I'm just wondering, do you want to put that slide up again? Let me take a picture of it. Guys, you've no idea what Louise and I have been doing in the background in order to make this session a success. It's not to tell you of our woes, which aren't. We love these sections, but we've had some personal. I've just been literally moving, and Louise is running off to catch a train to Paris, and all amidst that, we're so excited to host the session. So please. Please have your sense of humor ready if everything's not perfect, because we're trying to do it to the best of our ability, and we're so psyched to have the most amazing speakers. So if I falter, Joe, EJ, Dorota, your sequences, and just like come and help me out. But yeah, so whose time did I steal? Joe.
So handing over to Joe, and then EJ, and then Dorota's going to finish the session off for us. Great. So Joe, I'll stop sharing my screen and you just jump in, okay?
Thank you very much. Use this new fancy way that you showed me, Louise. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me along. It's great to be here. Sorry, there's something popped up on my screen. It's all good. So I'm Jo Potts. I work for Balfour Beatty. I'm the Sustainability Director for Responsible Sourcing and Social Impact. And I think the piece that I'm kind of hoping to bring to the conversation today is I bridge the gap between sustainability and procurement. So I think I offer a fairly unique perspective, particularly where organisations haven't joined those things up yet. So in terms of Balfour Beatty, just to give you a very, very quick brief view on sort of where we are. So we are a leading construction infrastructure company. We are based in the UK, the US, and we've got a joint venture in Hong Kong as well. You may have seen us, we do a number of different things, from decarbonising the UK energy grid to building and maintaining road networks. We build things like huge infrastructure projects in the US, bridges, hotels, all sorts of weird and wonderful things. We work with local authorities, flood defence, MOD, MOJ, and we also invest in student accommodation. So we cover a really wide range of things. We have been in existence for 115 years. We've got 26,000 employees across those three geographies. And we're involved in things like Hinkley Point, Sizewell, some really sort of key major infrastructure projects. I wanted to set the scene from a UK construction perspective. So the Modern Slavery Act in the UK has very much framed the conversation around human rights in the UK as well. So we talk around modern slavery, but it has a much wider context than modern slavery in some other countries, because everything from labour exploitation to workplace bullying effectively comes under that banner of modern slavery. It's sort of a scale of badness or meanness, as I like to refer to it. But because we've got the Modern Slavery Act, we've also got those bullet points up there that kind of set out when a company has to set out a modern slavery statement. And one of the things that we've actually done is ensured that regardless of a company's turnover, we're actually now expecting our supply chain to all have modern slavery statements, because we don't think your turnover should determine your views on whether or not slavery is bad in the supply chain, quite frankly. So just a little bit more in terms of setting the scene. So from a UK construction perspective, we have got, as of 2023, 2.12 million people employed in the UK in the construction sector. We are the second highest reported industry for labour exploitation, and that figure has come from that's come from Unseen. In 2023, Balfour Beatty as a business contracted with over 7,000 supply chain partners. About 30% of them were SMEs, and about 50% of them are with subcontractors. And there was a piece that Steve covered off in his presentation, which I thought was really, really pertinent. The supply chains in construction and infrastructure in the UK are long and they are complex. And therefore, the risk is quite often not with the suppliers that we are directly contracting with, but quite often in the tiers 2, 3, 4, 5 below that. In the sector, we've got two sort of key risks around modern slavery. The first one is from a labour perspective, so people on our projects, delivering our projects, particularly, and I know Steve covered this as well, particularly on sort of the lower skilled trades and things like that. And then the other risk is within our supply chain, so that responsible sourcing piece, understanding where our products are being made, manufactured, where raw materials are being extracted from. From a driver's perspective, I would say, so the construction industry is typically much further behind other industries. So if you look at retail, if you look at food and beverage, for example, I think that they are quite a few years ahead of us in terms of where we are. Our main drivers at this point in time are from clients. So clients like Scape, who are a framework provider essentially within our sector, are really pushing hard on human rights and modern slavery. Investors are starting to talk to this a lot more. I don't know if EJ is going to cover it off in her presentation, but we've had a lot more contact more recently with investors. And actually, I think the key driver for us at the moment as an industry is in risk. And it's why we spent a lot of time a couple of years ago building out, and we did this with Action Sustainability, a risk heat map. So this is something that's actually in our modern slavery statement. We've spent a lot of time working with our supply chain, with our procurement people within our business, and with an external consultancy to support us in identifying where the most risk exists. So we actually looked at this wider than just human rights and modern slavery. We looked at this across all sustainability, but we were able to map all of the different trades that we work with and all of the different goods and services that we buy. And then we are able to identify those with the highest risk. And that has then enabled a number of things for us to do across our business in terms of being able to prioritise those areas with highest risk. Thought this would be a really interesting one to cover off. When I've spoken around human rights and modern slavery previously, and when I talk to even people within our sector, quite often there's this finger pointing around who is actually responsible for human rights. And I think it's a really, really difficult one. Where I've seen this work really well, there isn't a singular owner for human rights and modern slavery within a business. It's a known shared responsibility. So within our business, we have a shared responsibility across sustainability, procurement, and the compliance and ethics team. I think it's very easy to finger point and blame everything on one person and look to one person to lead on that. But actually, it's that combination is where we've had greatest effect. And the images on the screen just represent where we've embedded then the human rights and modern slavery approaches in the different parts of the business. So it's within our sustainability strategy, it stands in there. Within our procurement strategy, it stands within there as well. And then it's also within our code of ethics. So it sits within compliance and ethics. So in every audience, in every document that we are sharing, it has naturally been embedded because it's owned by lots of different functions. I should say there is an HR element to this, absolutely, for our own employees, but I'm talking about this very much from a procurement perspective. So what have we done about this? So we've done the work, we've understood where all the biggest risks and things like that are. We created a supply chain modern slavery audit. It sounds horrible, I'm not going to lie to you. You say the word, you speak to your suppliers about coming and doing an audit, and everybody goes, oh gosh, an audit. It's scary. They quite often run in the opposite direction. They don't want to engage in the conversation. We've tried to do this in a very, very different way and take a very different approach. And I've used the word collaborative, and I know it's a word that is overused at the moment. I think everybody talks about being collaborative and we need to be collaborative. But we've developed this so that it's not an audit in the sense of a one snapshot in time. We've almost done it to build out the benchmark of where the suppliers are individually. So we actually go into the suppliers' offices, organisations, warehouses, wherever they're located. We sit down and we have the conversation. We work through the audit that we've created to essentially identify the benchmark, but we then don't stop there. It's not just a case of we've done an audit, you've passed, you've failed. We actually don't give them a pass or fail at all. What we do is we work with them to identify a continual improvement action plan, so that when we go back in 2 years' time and we go back through them again, we can show that continued improvement. We're also embedding it within our sort of QBRs and our B2Bs with those supply chain partners so that we can measure their progress more readily. And what we found that's been quite incredible out of this, and we weren't actually expecting it, is it's actually strengthened our relationships with our supply chain. because we're taking the time to have that conversation, and it's not in a finger pointing way, it's not in a these are all the things you're doing wrong. This is very much in that supportive, collaborative way. Our supply relationships have gone on, they've taken on a new sort of lease of life. And then we've also been able to pull together some targeted support. So there's a number of suppliers who perhaps aren't where we expect them to be. But rather than, again, being negative around that, we're giving them more hands-on support around that. And we've also identified that a number of suppliers have all got the same issues or the same concerns. So we're able to, again, provide very targeted support, inviting people to sort of webinars and things like that. And I know that we're quite short on time, so I've given you a very whistle-stop tour of this. But we have actually just been, little plug because I'm very excited about this, but we've actually been shortlisted for 2 SIPS awards as a result of the work that we've done. And I think that that's a testament to 2 things, which is, one, the journey we've been into upskill our procurement teams and really embed this in how they interact with our supply chain. And the second piece is that this was very much a collaborative effort, not just with procurement, but again, engaging with sustainability, engaging with compliance and ethics as well. And out of all of this, we've produced a really nifty, I think it's a pretty good guidance document for the supply chain as well, in terms of being able to point them to additional resources, free resources that exist externally. And my last slide, I think, is to talk very briefly about the collaboration across the industry. So the Supply Chain Sustainability School, of which EJ will probably provide you a little bit more information on, was set up in our industry, and what's really fantastic about it is they've been in existence for 12 years. So we talk about collaboration, but we're actually quite getting to a place where we're quite mature actually in having those open and honest conversations with ultimately our competitors. But it also brings together our clients, and it also brings together our supply chain. So when we're talking about collaborating, we are collaborating across the value chain. Provides free resources that we can use, so I can take them into Balfour Beatty and use them for my employees, but equally my supply chain partners can take them away for their own employees as well. So there's a phenomenal amount of free resources. There's access to specialist groups and sector topic groups within the school itself, of which I'm a co-chair for the Modern Slavery Working Group. And one of the things that's come out of that is the guidance that was produced last year around addressing modern slavery concerns within the supply chain for PV panels. I feel like I'm doing a bit of an awards, but we were actually shortlisted for an ED award out of that work as well. And I think, again, testament to the fact that, again, that's collaborating across supply chain, and actually multiple parts of the supply chain. So everything from our clients who are specifying things all the way down to our subcontractors who are actually sourcing and installing panels. That, I think, is the end of my presentation. I will absolutely have a look in the chat to see if there's any questions that I can answer, and hoping that's geared EJ up quite nicely for her presentation.
EJ, I think you go straight ahead if you're...
Okay. Yep, I'll jump straight in. That's great. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah, fab. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join you all today. So I'm EJ. This is me. I've been working in the field of sustainable supply chains now for coming up to 20 years. I've got 2 roles. I've got two kind of hats. Joe's already talked about one of them, which is me leading and facilitating built environment against slavery group. So it's the UK's largest anti-slavery collaboration in the built environment. And then my other hat is a senior consultant at Action Sustainability. So a bit of background to Action Sustainability. Well, not background, but these are some of the clients we work with, who we support in their due diligence in modern slavery, but also the wider labour exploitation piece. So a lot of experience in the built environment, but also in other sectors as well. You can see financial services, government, and so on. Okay, so I've been asked to talk specifically about the risks in facilities management and waste sectors today. So when we think about those categories that are particularly high risk, this is the kind of stuff we should be thinking about. So we've got cleaning, we've got security, manned guarding in particular, we've got things like landscaping and grounds maintenance, catering, food service, waste and recycling, The last one there, that's T. You're probably wondering, that's the odd one out. That's just a reminder really that we need to be thinking about the materials used or provided by those facilities management organisations. However, for today's presentation, I focus predominantly on the delivery of the service itself. So what is it that makes these areas particularly high risk? It goes right back to the areas that Catherine and Steve talked about earlier on. Where you have vulnerable people, you'll always have risks of exploitation and, of course, modern slavery. So the sectors mentioned here, they all have a prevalence of low-skilled or low-paid labour, where low barriers to entry. That's always a risk. Regardless of any sector, any geography, there's always an increased risk there. High migrant workforce as well. So think about if people don't speak the local language, they may not be aware of or understand what they're entitled to, their basic rights. A simple example of this, in the UK, when the Ukraine war started, I became good friends with a Ukrainian refugee. And I heard through her how other refugees were being exploited in the catering sector. They were really grateful to be given a job. Wow, I've got a job. Their employers were telling them that they were getting £4 an hour and that that's a normal wage. It's not legal, and that they were only entitled to one break a day. They didn't know that they were being exploited. They just thought, crikey, life in the UK is pretty hard. We recognise these sectors as being areas where we use lots of temporary labour or labour agencies as well. Again, huge red flag here, and I'll share an example in a moment with you about this. But what I see a lot of is businesses subcontracting to labour agencies. They get that contract signed, they get their code of conduct. It may reference things like committing to assurance of zero exploitation or forced labour. More about that a bit later. But the assumption is then that, well, the contract's been signed, job is done, and the risks of human rights or exploitation are low now because we've ticked the boxes, we've done our due diligence. Not quite the case. Again, we'll look at that in a moment. Labour shortages. Where you have labour shortages, there will always be increased risks. Imagine you're desperate to get your hands on workers to finish a job, to clean the building, to help with the catering. You just need the manpower now. And I think we all know it in these scenarios. You probably ask less questions about due diligence than you normally would when you're in a rush, rather than go through the correct processes. It's a bit like kind of, oh, I need workers now, head in the sand. Can you afford to take those kind of risks? Probably not. Think about where you have workers working out of sight as well. Think of cleaners, security. They're kind of invisible to customers. They're often working outside of standard office hours. It's much easier for an exploiter to put their victims to work where there are less eyes watching them, less chance of people kind of spotting something that doesn't look quite right. Also think about where you have high churn and fluctuating demand for labour. There's always an increased risk there as well. So a few examples to kind of bring these risks to life. I'm afraid these examples are all UK based, but hopefully you can all relate. So first of all, a main contractor a couple of years ago in the construction sector shared how they'd done some unannounced, unexpected visits to their sites during Christmas, so quiet time when the site was not operating. They wanted to check the site security. They found a man there in a porter cabin who was a victim of slavery. He'd been there for a few days. He'd been told not to leave. He had a bottle of water. He got a loaf of bread. On paper, so on the records, that person wasn't there. The records show approved personnel coming onto site and leaving, but the reality was very different. I met a lady recently who was a survivor with lived experience. So she was in forced labour, working as a cleaner for months, again, actually on a construction site. When she spoke, what was so powerful was that she said not once in any of her time working on sites did anybody ask any personal questions. Do you have a family? Where do you live? Tell me about yourself. Her words were, I was invisible. Nobody noticed me. And that this was the culture on the sites where she worked. And what she said was, if somebody had asked her a question, you know, tell us about your family, where do you live? She said she probably would have broken down. She wouldn't have told them she was a victim of slavery because she was scared. But that could have been the red flag to somebody to call someone and say, something's not right here. And that could have saved her. So And the last example here, Operation Fort, it's one of the UK's largest anti-slavery prosecutions, where more than 400 Polish victims, they were put to work in businesses across the UK, including in rubbish or garbage recycling plants, farms and warehouses. These are the exploiters here, not the victims. The gangs were particularly strategic in how they infiltrated a recruitment agency. So the lady, third from the top left, Juliana, she was responsible for managing the labour contract for a really large client. She was the only Polish speaker. She was turning away genuine job seekers to make room for the trafficked men. She was the one who did all the interviews, dealt with all employment forms, and on top of that, her role was to regularly tour the premises to check up on workers. She was the go-to person for any grievance. She carried out inductions and she kept a record of accidents. And you can see there, the amount of control she had seems sinister now, but nobody realised at the time. And comments from people who knew her said she was extremely professional. She was kind of employee of the year type material. So really stark warnings there, and we'll share the link to that report. So before we jump into some procurement do's and don'ts, which I'll finish on, just want to be clear on what due diligence is. And I know we've already touched on this, but just to make sure we're really clear, it's that ongoing risk management process to identify, prevent, manage and mitigate the risks, and then account for how adverse impacts are addressed. That last bit I always think sounds a bit complicated, but that's basically about if you find any issues, how will you fix it? How will you make sure it doesn't happen again? So due diligence is not asking questions like, can you provide assurance of zero slaves in your operations and supply chain, please? It's not about what are you doing to ensure slavery doesn't exist. That's kind of sticking your head in the sand again and maybe demonstrating that you don't fully understand the nature of the risks out there, because slavery is there, exploitation is out there. You need to find it, prevent it, find it and fix it. And the wheel here, again, similar to the wheel that they shared earlier on, this is much broader than procurement. Effective due diligence and risk management requires all this other stuff to be in place. It's what's in your policies. How is this embedded into your governance models? How is resource allocated to address these issues? Do you consider human rights as part of your core risk management processes? Again, touching on what Joe mentioned earlier on, and the other colleagues at Ergon. I could talk for hours on all this, but I've only got 3 minutes left. No, 4 minutes, I'm fine. So just moving on to do's and don'ts for procurement. These are just some. Of course, I could list a lot more here. So if we're thinking about new procurements, or indeed where you've already got the contract already let, it's so important to acknowledge the risks of exploitation and modern slavery with your suppliers or potential suppliers. You know, we know there's a risk there, guys. We know we need to work together to address it. That's a very different approach to you need to manage this. Don't risk dump and make it their problem. If you address it in a way that's collaborative, as Joe hit the nail on the head, it builds a culture of trust and collaboration. And I would say the best examples of this is when you get clients who say, EJ, can you run a workshop for us and for our high-risk supply chain together? We're all going to get together. We're going to get our procurement teams, some of our sustainability teams, wider people in the business, and our high-risk suppliers, because we all need to learn and understand more about this. Okay. What next? So use evidence-based questions in the supplier qualification process. And again, I'm sure you've talked about this in previous sessions with the Sustainable Procurement Pledge. So in the pre-qualification and in tenders, ask things like, you know, we're committed to addressing slavery and labour exploitation in our supply chains. Please provide details of your approach to this issue, your due diligence. So what you're signalling there is that you're looking for more than, well, here's my policy, you know, tick. It's about more than that. It's about, you know, asking how are your staff trained? How are they collaborating with peers, with their supply chain? How do they ensure that workers are aware of their rights? What grievance mechanisms do they have in place? How do they ensure that everyone knows what to do if they spot something isn't quite right? It's all this stuff here on the right-hand side on the wheel. So it's about thinking about questions like that through the pre-qualification and procurement. Then it comes to contract clauses. It's about developing those clauses, again, that support due diligence throughout the duration of the contract. So it's not the whole kind of let and forget, which I've got there on the right-hand side. Building requirements to monitor and manage these aspects and report on them. Contract management, again, it's been mentioned quite a few times. Don't forget to upskill the contract managers. Everybody in a business needs to be upskilled on modern slavery, labour exploitation, human rights. But the contract managers, they have such a key role. They need to, not only do they need to understand on kind of what they need to do, but they need to be really clear on why this is important, the risks to the business as well as to the people, and what their role is in the find it, fix it, prevent it side of things, that kind of idea of empowering people. And then because they need to bring those discussions into those contract management discussions. So it's just considered along with health and safety and all those other issues. It's just there, standing agenda item. What else have we got on here? Include requirements for social audits and worker surveys. But again, as has been made clear earlier on, remember they're just one tool in a bigger toolkit. And collaborate. I've kind of highlighted that one. Get involved in industry peer groups. You're here today, so you're already doing that. Try to keep your fingers on where the risks are in your sector, what the landscape, the evolving landscape is looking like, and learn from others. And as Joe says, anyone who says you can't collaborate on this with your competitors, peers, supply chain, I challenge you to sit on our Built Environment Against Slavery group. Everybody's very open, sharing insights and ideas on how we can work better and use that combined procurement leverage to drive real change. So I've got about 2 minutes left. I'll probably finish before then. I'm not going to talk through all of these don'ts. Which one? Let me just look. Which ones haven't I discussed? Yeah, we've talked about, sorry, the phrase around zero tolerance to modern slavery. I would question who would tolerate it. You know, it's okay to say it's not a bad thing, but really, you know, there's more you can be saying about that in your policies. And don't rely on certifications and standards as well. So going back to the example of the security guard that I mentioned earlier on, that company said, well, all our security workers, they're all SEIA accredited. Well, yes, they are, but how do you know that they're the people who are actually doing the work? I think that's everything I wanted to talk. Oh no, sorry, my slide on the school. So the Supply Chain Sustainability School has got lots of resources to help. This is a key place we'll send a link to, because you can go in. There's a whole section on resources for risk identification and assessment. It includes all those resources that were shared at the beginning of the session today, but also broader ones as well. Equally, if you want to look at procurement, supply chain management, go in there. We've got 170 resources. So do go and have a dig around. And I think that is everything, apart from just some upcoming events that we've got through the school, which are free to attend. I'll pop links into the chat, but there's one on practicalities on how to evaluate risk. There's one which is then how to embed. It's more about those kind of contract clauses, how to embed those contract clauses into the procurement. And you can see the rest there. And this one as well, a live assessment to benchmark your own modern slavery due diligence. So that's everything from me. Thank you very much. And let me have a look actually if there are any questions. Do you want me to look at questions now?
There were just some questions. I think EJ, I think this is great. Why don't we give the floor to Dorota to continue, and you can have a good look, because there are a couple of comments as well as questions, and I think there are a couple of more. I certainly put one for Joe, so that's why I missed
sounds good.
But thank you very much, EJ. Dorota, over to you. But you're on mute, so please unmute yourself. This is a typical.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to hear you. I hope you see my screen. Everything is clear. Okay. Yes. Nice to be here with you, and nice to be the cherry on the cake, because I've listened to all of the presentation. I think there is something in my presentation that will be linked to the previous one. My name is Dorota Wiacek. I'm representing Roche, one of the largest pharma companies. I work for global procurement, and I am program manager responsible for supplier sustainability audit, assurance visits audits. What's the program about and how this program is a cherry on the cake in this procurement lifecycle, I will tell you in a moment. But let me just jump into our Roche world. And for more than 125 years, both in our own operations as well as in our value chain, we have fostered the protection of the human rights. And we are committed in operating in ways that will enhance society and the environment. And this commitment includes the behavior of our suppliers, all of our suppliers. With in Roche global procurement and procurement of all procurement functions, we support our mission, doing now what patients need next, by collaborating with all of our suppliers and business partners to achieve our sustainability strategy and our sustainability goals, including human rights. We do have a supplier code of conduct. The document is required to be included in every single Roche contract. And within this document, within the Roche supplier code of conduct, we have incorporated 5 key principles of pharmaceutical supply chain initiative. Pharmaceutical supply chain initiative is the initiative that was created by the large pharma companies some time ago. And together with all of the pharma companies, we try to build responsible supply chain for pharma industry. And with pharmaceutical supply chain initiative, we operate on 5 key principles. These are ethics, human rights, health and safety, management system, and environment. And all of those principles and values are part of our Roche Supplier Code of Conduct and are a baseline for our Supplier Sustainability Assurance Visit Program, SSAV, that I will tell you a little bit more. But before that, I would like to tell a little bit more on the risk assessment, human rights risk assessment in the procurement cycle. And I think it will be known for all of the procurement specialists that we have several different stages, and we need to make sure that we do understand how to approach the risk at each stage, and what the actions and activity to take to make sure that we have identified the risk, that we have analyzed it, that we have planned the mitigation actions. So from the supplier selection, stage, we need to make sure that we do everything that we want to do to analyze the risk with potential supplier that we want to start a cooperation with. So this is the due diligence for potential suppliers. Of course, the human rights related risk will be a part of the due diligence with any other areas that we need to assess the risk with. But we need to remember that we need to start the supplier selection also having this human rights risk incorporated in the due diligence phase. And this is what EJ said. This is this awareness that all of the all of the procurement specialists need to be aware of. Then we go to the onboarding. So we decided, okay, we did this the due diligence. We selected the supplier. We are moving on. We want to onboard the supplier. So we want to make sure that we have mitigated all of the risks and secure them somehow in the contract, in the agreement that we have, that we discussed with supplier, any kind of corrective actions that are already needed. Then we move on to the active risk management. So we are actively cooperating with our suppliers. So we do the risk assessment on supplier level, but of course, from the category or material level, we need to have an awareness which of the suppliers we need to have a focus on. So we need to have this the visibility of the criticality on the category or / material level. And of course, in pharma industry, for example, we know that we will be on the material level, we will be cooperating with highly specialized laboratories or manufacturers. So there, we supposed to have rather high technologies and people with high qualifications, but still we need to make sure that these people do have health and safety environment, that they are well paid, that they do have working hours properly recorded. So this is something we need to focus on. And of course, from active risk management, apart from the supplier risk, apart from the supply chain criticality assessment, we also need to have the visibility on what's going on around us. So risk monitoring, alerts that will be sent somehow from our sources of information, different platforms. There are multiple platforms that we can use with information, what's going on, what happened. And for example, from these alerts, we might have information that there are more and more situations when from our suppliers' perspective, there will be cases related to discrimination or harassment, not in their laboratories or manufacturing sites, but at the offices. For example, from IT providers. So we need to also have it in mind. Then we move to the performance management. So how we deal with our suppliers, how the business react on the risk, and of course the last phase of boardings, how we mitigate activities at the end of the cooperation. If we think of and if we touch the point of supplier sustainability assurance visits, so the SSAV program that Roche performs, this is in the area of active risk management, but of course it touches also some performance management. And I will just tell you a little bit on the SSAV program. So the SSAV is, as I said, the last tool that we use, the last tool that we use on the risk assessment. This is the last moment that we can assess our suppliers according to the PSCI principles and check their compliance with our Roche Supplier Code of Conduct. But how we do that? We plan the suppliers on the risk-based methodology. The risk-based methodology is built on mainly two parameters. The external parameters you can see on the bottom of the page. The external parameters are the sustainability-linked one and are based on the country. So we take a look on the supplier and where supplier is located. In which country the supplier is located. And on this country based, we are using different indexes to assess the risk on human rights. So you can see the Kids' Rights Index, Corruption Perception Index, Global Slavery, different indexes that will give us a little bit of insights on the human rights from this particular perspective. And of course, we add some other sustainability criteria related to different international conventions, conflict minerals, etc. So this is the external perspective, the external base that we use. But of course, apart from this external perspective, we need to take a consideration on the business. So what is the business that we are doing with this particular supplier? And as we said, there are, I think Joe mentioned, and EJ also mentioned, that there are some industry segmentation that will be linked to a higher risk for human rights, like building and construction services, like cleaning services, like waste management, like logistics and transportation, the warehouses employees. This industry segmentation, at least from pharma industries, need to be also taken into consideration and treated with a higher perspective for the risk. So we are planning the audits, we are planning the assurance visit, then we are using the PSCI protocols and standards to perform the audits, to perform the assessment. We are using an independent audit service provider, a third-party auditors that assess the compliance. And then, of course, as in any other audit process, we do have a summary of the findings. If there are any findings, we have a corrective action plan that we prepare together with the supplier, and then we do the follow-up together with supplier and with our auditors if we have any critical or major findings. So this is how we assess, how we execute, and how we follow up and make sure that our suppliers do follow our principles and do share our values with the usage of the standard and protocols that we prepare together with other pharma companies within the PSCI. But as I said, the audit is the last tool. The audit is the cherry on the cake. How to make sure that we will do the proper approach, that we will do the proper supplier selected, and how make sure that we will have the ability and the possibility to make the audit at the end. We need to remember as a procurement specialist, that procurement expert, that at every stage of the procurement cycle, we need to do additional activities to make sure that we identified, we investigated, we analyzed, and we mitigated as early as possible the risk that we observed. So as you can see, the supplier selection, I mentioned the due diligence, different risks need to be analyzed. We need to focus on the services because, as EJ mentioned, usually we are focusing on the business criticals perspective, but sometimes the human rights risk might be hidden behind some less important services and less important products from the business perspective, like hotels, hotel services, cleaning services, etc. This is something we need to have it in mind, and we need to have this awareness. And the tool that we can use, of course, there are different tools and different approaches. EJ also said that evidence-based tools we should use. Of course, from the PSCI, we have self-assessment questionnaire. This is a questionnaire that has a lot of different questions from all of those 5 areas, but of course, it might help us to gather some insights on suppliers' processes. During the supplier onboarding phase, of course, risk mitigation clauses in contracts, agreements. For example, what is extremely important to have the statement related to any kind of codes of conduct that you in your company have, or the audit rights, because then in the end, when we would like to have a kind of assurance visit or an audit, however we call it, if we do not have this audit right in the agreement, we cannot do anything. So this is something we need to remember about. Risk management, active risk management, as I said, the category materiality risk assessment, to make sure that we have this risk focus and we know what to focus on and understand the supply chain. Then we have the risk on the supplier assessment, supplier level, covering different perspective on the performance of the supplier, on the country perspective, external, internal parameters. All of those need to be taken into consideration to make sure that we have identified the risk and we have worked with supplier to mitigate them. And as I said, active risk monitoring, so be open and be aware that around us world is rapidly changing, and we need to have our eyes open, because the human rights risk might be hidden somewhere in the offices, not in the production or manufacturing side, but in the offices. White collars also might be treated badly with the human rights from the human rights perspective. For the performance stage, of course, this is important, how we cooperate with supplier, how supplier responds to any kind of any kind of risk alerts or any kind of findings that will discover. If we want to work together and build proper processes together with supplier, with our business partner, there are different tools and different techniques and different materials that we can use. From the PSCI platform, there is a possibility to assess yourself. Also, with the human rights perspective, assess your level of maturity in the human rights area, and if your supplier feels not comfortable or unsure of the solutions, there are a lot of different materials, for example, human rights primers that also can be used to explain the importance of every single part of the human rights aspects. And offboarding, last thing, of course, to make sure that when we close the business with supplier, we will mitigate all of the risk, and we will prepare a proper business continuity plans, also including human rights risks that we discovered. That's all from my side. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you all for listening, and yeah, doing now what patient needs next.
Thank you very much, Dorota. Thank you, Steve, Catherine, Joe, EJ. That was really a whistle-stop tour. I wanted to share with the audience that's still with us. We moved from a panel where we had questions directed to the presenters to actually a presentation, given the fact that there's so much rich and detailed content that was required to explain and set the scene, that it became a mini panel session with a lot of actually activity in the chat. So thank you so much for everybody who has contributed, both the presenters as well as the audience. I think most questions have been answered, and there are, of course, some more complex questions. I didn't pick out one that was specifically shouted out to be answered. I don't know whether you guys, Joe, Steve, EJ, Catherine, Dorota, found any that you want to answer now. We have a couple of minutes, or you want to have a few last words to close off the session. I wanted to start, EJ, go for it. I wanted to summarize, but there's so much to summarize. I think we're probably going to have a summary session at the end. EJ, you go.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. I thought you were asking us to share.
Yeah,
so I think there was a question on, what was it? How do you address people who state we must have 0 examples of slavery in the supply chain? I think Joe's covered a lot of that off. For me, it links to that education piece as well. And slowly, as we become more mature in this area, businesses are starting to be a bit more open about what they're finding. It's an example I bang on about all the time, but there's a company called First Solar, a solar PV manufacturer. They did some audits in their Malaysian supply chains, and then they came out and they told everybody, we did some audits and we found labour exploitation and slavery. And it was in the news, and they got really positive coverage from our sector saying, well done. Imagine if everybody who found stuff like this shared it. We'd all be a lot better at acknowledging there's risk there and learning from what we'd found. I get that there's issues around investors and concerns about shareholders, but look at Tony Chocolonely. That's an example of the direction of travel. So I think the more we get businesses being open, sharing what they found, the less we'll see of that kind of zero tolerance approach, because people will begin to realize it really is there, even in the best supply chains that are out there.
And I guess you're right, EJ. I think where people are so afraid of, and you guys and Steve and Catherine are so, you're really knowledgeable about this area, and you work across the different sections. And certainly in my experience, a lot of people are afraid to show their hand. But I think if somebody else points a finger at you, it's much more scarier than if you point the finger at yourself, so to speak, or if you put your hands up and say, I'm working on it. But I see, Steve, you have a hand up, so please, I hand over to you.
No, I think it's just picking up on sort of, concluding remarks, but also on one of the questions that was there, is that which was about sort of pricing and costing. I think increasingly we're going to have to look at these things, and also I think increasingly, I get from UK, the UK is kind of dominated on modern slavery, but it's also been a big distraction, right? So let's be very clear, the legislation is limited, but also it's meant people have done lots of resources looking at modern slavery and nothing on a whole range of other issues, particularly issues like low pay, looking at issues of how you cost things. And I think EJ said, no one argues with modern slavery. But when you get in and say, okay, the problem is we're not paying people enough, or we're not taking women and challenges around gender-based violence seriously enough, that's a harder one, right? So I think particularly for those, UK, Australia, where modern slavery has been the issue, we need to move on, and we need to move really fast, because I think as far as the European legislation, that's expecting a lot more than this, and it's expecting us to look at both culturally challenging issues and also pricing issues.
Thank you. It's certainly a massive topic, complex topic, and we could continue on and on. I'm conscious that we've allowed 1 hour and 15 for this session. It's a longer session because of the quality and the amount of presenters and the richness of the topic. I would like to thank everybody wholeheartedly for contributing and joining. I also would like to ask the presenters, actually, as well as the audience, please come back to Lorraine, Louise and me and the SPP team. Give us feedback and tell us what else you'd like to discuss, whether something is specifically like, for example, the balance of low cost and doing the right thing, whether something warrants a separate session that you'd like to participate in or share your experience. We're here to learn from each other, to enrich each other on that topic. This is a journey, and we're super delighted that we've had that session today. So I think with that, thank you ever so much. And I'm sure we'll be in touch. Thank you.